seen in either a photograph or something else. Oh, sorry, there's a little note here I have to click on about allowing this to be recorded. Okay, there we go. That has to do with our understanding of a person like Mussolini and Hitler, which in some ways boggles our minds in modernity. That is, we look at the images of Mussolini and we think, what a buffoon. I mean, this guy is dressed up in this glorious military uniform. He's thrusting out his chest and his chin, and he's strutting on the stage. And we think, what? You gotta be kidding me. He must have been a real idiot, but he's also just a showman. That is actually far from the truth. And until we can put ourselves back into the time frame of the early 20s, when Mussolini began to gain power and eventually assume power in 1922, we really miss something vital in understanding not just the history of the time, but we fail to see any correlation with today. And you can pick whatever politician you wish and try to make comparisons. And many people have already done that if you listen to our political discourse. But at the same time, we need to think of what was going on back then, that a man like Mussolini could achieve the kinds of power that he did. And we will do something very similar with Hitler, though Hitler and Mussolini were very different in the way they presented themselves to their public and how they achieved dominance in the political sphere in their respective countries. So, oh, I'm sorry, this thing goes in different directions. Here we go. I put this forward because there's a certain program, and I would actually suggest you might look at it on Netflix, I believe, which is called, I think, The Makings of a Tyrant. And it has to do with 6 episodes that deal with how certain individuals, usually very bad individuals, become tyrants. And this goes from people like Idi Amin, whom we may recall was the so-called president of Uganda, to Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi and so on and so forth. But it also deals with Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and others. And we ask ourselves, what is it about these characters which leads people to not only accept them, but to promote them as their leaders, as the decision makers? And these are some of the elements that I think are very important. And if we think about politicians today in our own country, many times we will see a very similar set of characteristics. One of the keys, and this is particularly true of people like Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, Mussolini, is they quite seriously spoke from the heart. There wasn't a sense of duplicity or hypocrisy in terms of what they said. They believed seriously, deeply, fundamentally in the things they were saying. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't capable of duplicity. They certainly were. But usually their duplicity was to maneuver their opponents into positions where they could be either diminished to the point of impotence, or they could be overthrown if they were the people in charge of the government. And as you read through elements of the political histories that occur through the 20s and 30s, this becomes a very important element. We've heard the term that politics is a blood sport. And quite literally, it was true during this period of time, or bare knuckled. And if you look back even in American history, almost from the beginning, there were times in Congress that opponents literally were bare knuckled against each other. One of the most outstanding examples, and I use this just to keep us in a proper perspective, is Charles Sumner being beat over the head by Preston Brooks in the Senate chamber after a speech Sumner gave. And Sumner was literally out of the Senate for 6 to 12 months as a result of the beating he took. So keep these things in mind because they are very important and make what we're talking about relevant rather than just a concept of histories. Now, Mussolini's background was hardly extraordinary. He was born in a small town, Romagna, in northern Italy. His father was a blacksmith and a deep socialist in his own thinking. And yet, his mother was a devout Catholic. And indeed, Mussolini stuck with Catholicism for a good while in his early years until eventually he drifted away from it. When I say he was well educated, I don't mean that he was university PhD graduate and this kind of thing, though there were many people who became important leaders who were. But at the same time, he read extensively, enormously, all kinds of things. He read and wrote about Karl Marx, for example, and for a time was very much in favor of things that Karl Marx was saying. He read Nietzsche and other deep philosophers. He taught himself German and French in order to be able to read them in their particular language. Now, he went to Switzerland for a period of time, partly because of turmoil at home, partly because he needed a job and was interested in making waves, if you will, or even early on in the political era. But when he returned, he became an editor of several newspapers through this period of time. And it brought him enormous prominence because of the writing he did. He wrote article after article after article, promoting socialist agendas, and joined up as part of this editorial connection with the Socialist Party in Italy. He became a prominent spokesman and then became a sort of secondary leader among the socialists. So these things are particularly important because he was not a stupid person by any stretch of the imagination. During his lifetime, he even opposed the war in Libya. Now, we don't know much about this, but back in the early I think it was roughly 1912-13, Italy went to war with the Ottoman Empire over Libya, and in effect, conquered Libya, at least in the sense that the Ottomans were no longer in charge, but they ended up fighting in Libya literally for a decade or more. Now, Libya itself had no particular resources which were of great significance. The initial intent was to resettle population from Italy into Libya, for example, establish it as an outlet for the population in Italy, because Italy itself is relatively poor in resources. As those of you who may have traveled in Italy know, it's a very mountainous country. You don't have wide open tracts that you can farm, and you're very restricted in terms of energy and minerals. So what you needed is an outlet for your population. So this was part of the drive, because Libya itself did not appear to have much in the way of resources either. As a result of this particular move, however, Mussolini was firmly against it, something that most people would not believe. And indeed, he saw this as merely the oppression of a people in Libya. Similarly, he saw what was happening prior to World War I as the oppression of Italians under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that there were portions of northern, what we now recognize as northern Italy, which were still under the control of the Habsburgs. And he wanted those people integrated back into a greater Italy. It wasn't so much the taking of land as it was reincorporating your people. As he moved ahead, when World War I broke out, he was actually of two minds. He in part was against the war, but as he learned and looked more deeply into what was going on, and in particular the oppression of Italian peoples under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he became firmly convinced that it was necessary for Italy to join the war on the part of the Entente powers, France, Britain at the time. And he indeed stepped up. He joined the army. Now, he was cast out of the Socialist Party because the socialists at the time were very much opposed to joining the war. Perhaps the socialists saw this as a deeply destructive event in Italian history because of the costs involved, not just human life, but the financial costs that would be accrued as a result. Remember that Italy got in the war after bargaining with France and Britain about gaining territory, particularly the territory on the north of the Adriatic, Trieste, Fiume, and then down the Adriatic coast on the Balkan side, so that the Adriatic Sea would become, in effect, an Italian lake. So this trade-off was something that got Italy into the war, but his particular impetus for joining was really based on something a little different, because he didn't know about the territorial agreements that were being struck. He began then, therefore, to publish his own paper, the Popolo d'Italia, right, the people of Italy, if you will. And again, he began to establish through his writings, through this paper, his particular ideology as it was formulating in his mind. And in this, in particular, the importance of the nation, of the state, this was key. The concept, therefore, was Italy as a nation, as an idea, political idea, rather than a political boundary, became his particular formulation. And there were certain dynamics that were required if a nation, any nation, was to survive in this complex geopolitical atmosphere that World War I represented, and in particular, as we see what happens in the aftermath of World War I. He fought in this war as a Bersaglieri. That's his picture on the right with the very famous feathered cap that they have. And he was even recognized by his superiors as being particularly brave and could endure hardship that would buckle other people. So in the sense that when we look at Mussolini and we see these later pictures of him as a buffoon and strutting, what we have to remember is he put himself in line for his beliefs. And indeed, he was wounded partly by accident. It turned out to be a friendly mortar shell that blew up. It wasn't really friendly fire in the usual sense. It was an accident, but he was significantly wounded. And as a result, he had to spend time going back and recovering. When he got out of the war and the war ended, he began to reconnect with his paper, Popolo d'Italia. He wrote more extensively, and he created a political network that linked up with more nationalistic oriented organizations that were now in direct conflict with the rising socialists and communists within Italy. Italy, like many countries after World War I, began to fall into a state of chaos. And the chaos literally occurred on the streets, where there was intense fighting that occurred. And at this point, basically, people in the country were almost being forced to choose sides. It was very hard to sit this out. Now, many people in the rural communities, the farmers, whatever, fishermen on the coast and the rest of it, might feel they could ignore what was happening in the cities in particular. But at the same time, as we know, Italy is not a big country. So what happens in the city can quickly be understood and experienced even in the countryside. Mussolini saw that if there was to be a future for Italy, then there had to be an organization which could surmount the challenges, not just from the socialists and the communists, but even from an increasingly inefficient and, in his mind, deficient government. The government found itself incapable of controlling the chaos. This is a little bit different story from what we'll see elsewhere. As a result, over the period of time from the end of the war, he organized among the people he could find and the adherents he could establish with different organizations, this concept of the Fascisti. Now, today, the word fascist is absolutely seen as despicable. It's akin to our using the word Nazi, all right? But at the same time, we have to remember that the destructiveness that occurred from fascism was in the future. It wasn't seen as that. At the time, the fascist concept, yes, was centered on nationalism. Yes, it involved violence against communists and socialists who were equally violent in return. And not even in return, might have instigated a number of events, as we'll see when we get to Germany, for example. In this particular situation, it was, as occurred elsewhere, thank you, in Germany, that it was necessary to have an armed group. And we know this group is the Black Shirts. Many of these were veterans of the war. Now, again, put this into some perspective. The Italian experience in World War I was horrible. You may recall, if you attended the previous set of lectures, that there were things like the 12th Battle of the Isonzo, right? The same fighting over the same territory 12 times with very little to show for it. You may remember the Austro-Hungarian German offensive called Caporetto, which drove the Italian army from its borders, almost allowed Venice to be captured. They were back on the Tagliamento River before they stabilized it. If you want a novel of that, read Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, as an example. Enormously destructive, enormously debilitating, and hundreds of thousands of people were killed or wounded or went missing. So veterans returning from the war in 1918, after peace has been settled, needed to find a place to go. And they felt very strongly, many of them, about the importance of the nation. Now, there was a whole nother group that felt communism was the answer, and others who felt socialism was the answer. So this was a very fractured society. If you're going to go fight in the streets, you want veterans. And you could organize them, bring them together, support them, and try to dominate your opponent. When Mussolini decided the time had come to try to take control of the Italian government, he arranged something which was called the March on Rome, 1922 October. And he organized a good many people to go to Rome with the intent to force the resignation of Luigi Facta, who was the prime minister at the time and was considered, though somewhat liberal in thinking, ineffective. Now, when Mussolini did this, it wasn't entirely clear, even to Mussolini, what the result would be. And this wasn't necessarily intended as a coup d'etat, but it quickly formulated into that for the following reason. The King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, was asked by Facta, as a matter of fact, to call out the army and suppress this march. And Victor Emmanuel at that time had the authority solely to agree to call out the army. Facta couldn't do it himself as prime minister. The authority rested with the king. Another interesting legal aspect, right? And how, if, again, as a real subtitle to this whole thing, you could say how laws affected behavior, right?
For the bathroom, I
This
can take.
particular time- I'm sorry. Okay. So it's an interesting side story, which we'll delve into a little bit when we get into this more with Germany. The important part was that Victor Emmanuel felt that calling out the army would create a civil war, that there was enough opposition, even within the army itself, to split the army and to get these factions now literally working to overthrow. Yes.
Were the black shirts mostly veterans?
Mostly, but not entirely. Many people were political opportunists, agitators. You know, what you do is infiltrate a crowd, say of a communist gathering, and you'd start creating dissension and riling things up, and then the black shirts would be waiting around the corner. Or conversely, the communists would be waiting around the corner in order to come and beat people over the head, right? This was not a matter that one group was necessarily bad and the other group was evil, right? They were literally fighting for power and for public approval and opinion and support. Mussolini happened to be the most powerful among them, but his march on Rome solidified his position. And as a result, Victor Emmanuel, trying to avoid civil war, decided that he would get rid of Facto and he would appoint Mussolini. Now, interestingly, in the National Assembly that resulted, Mussolini's power was still very restricted. He did not own the legislature. He had to form coalitions in order to achieve what he had hoped to achieve by remaining as prime minister. And there are a number of challenges throughout his tenure up until the beginning of World War II, where it had a great deal of tension that existed. But as you'll see, under the Acerbo law, he was able to convince part of his coalition. This was not just the Fascisti who were doing this. He had to develop a coalition which set up this particular system. And notice that what it does is it gives ascendancy to the organization which achieves at least the largest share, right? And at least 25%. What that tells you is how many factions were vying for power. In our country, we tend to think of two primary factions, Republicans and Democrats. We forget about the Libertarians and the Communist Party, which actually exists, and things of this sort. And if you voted today, that you have the Working Families Party as another organization. These things back in Italy had national representation. In our current government, the only person who's not technically identified as a Democrat or a Republican is Bernie Sanders, right? He calls himself an independent socialist. Back then, it wasn't set up this way. So getting 25% of the vote was not necessarily easy. But this was created and accepted because it was felt necessary for the government to be able to function. And if all you had were factions and no dominance, then nothing would get done. It would all be broken up and governments would fall because there would be no confidence in the so-called dominant power. But if they only had 40% of the seats, then the other 60 could gang up against him and stop them. And this happened frequently up to this point. Once, however, the Fascisti and Mussolini's party gained this kind of control, they could begin to promulgate various laws and functions which would limit the ability of the opposition. Now, we see this as primarily an expression of gaining power. But what we end up not asking ourselves is, what was the intention of having the power in the first place? What were your plans? And we'll come to that in just a moment. So the important part to remember here is that the idea at this particular time, 1922, and then subsequently 1924 and so on, was to create an efficiently functioning government. And if you could eliminate opposition, you could tend, in the words of a utopian, unify the country around one idea. Now, we as Americans recognize that a single set of ideas running a country is generally a bad thing. Even if we agree with the policies that are being implemented, without dissension, we have no control, no buttress, no boundary. So this idea of having a utopia of a unified country is something that leads to a serious form of repression, and particularly of ideas and creativity, as well as balance. It basically lets the government decide what's good and what's bad. Now, one of the important philosophers is that this fellow, whom we really don't hear anything about, Giovanni Gentile, who also, with Mussolini, ended up writing a series of very important seminal articles which described what fascism was to be at its core. Now, the ideas that are put in here can resonate with most of us at some level. The key element here, and it became expressed by Mussolini himself as a form of totalitarianism, but not the necessarily tyrannical totalitarianism, as a political and economic totalitarianism. The idea is the supremacy of the state. I alluded to this in the last set of lectures last week. The idea that the individual cannot exist outside the state. If you look around the world in the 1920s and the time prior to that, going back into the 1800s, when colonialism was becoming rampant, particularly in places like Africa, right? Because prior to that, the Americas had been settled in the 1700s and 1600s, and India in the 1700s and so on. In this particular experience, it was pretty clear for Europeans going into places like Africa, as an example, was they looked at those so-called societies and said, they got nothing. I'll give you an example. About a year ago, Jean and I went to Kenya for a wedding. My nephew was getting married in Kenya. And we went on a photograph safari afterward. And there are some extraordinary places that you go to. One of the things that struck me was that when you walk out to or drive out to a particular place and you see this huge plain with grasses growing in it, and you think, if I were here in the early 1800s from Europe, and I see what's here, I would say, boy, we could grow anything here. We could have thousands of cattle here. Now, of course, you don't know about the indigenous diseases that kills them all off, but that's a different story. The point I'm trying to make is that in coming to these places, Europeans in particular had come from a remarkably advanced social network and saw what to them was sort of loosey-goosey approach to everything. And how could these individuals survive if you don't have a strong social network that controls and organizes and develops, brings modernity to this place? So the ethos is something that Gentile, Mussolini, others were beginning to develop conceptually. They didn't know what was going to happen in the 40s and 50s and on beyond that, right? You have to go back at that time and kind of say to yourself, what was the world like if I lived there? What would be my attitude towards things. The idea, therefore, is the supremacy of the state as the ultimate protector of the individual. Now, in our own in our own Declaration of Independence, we say, and governments are instituted among men in order to preserve these rights. In other words, without government, you can't protect those rights. Yes.
It strikes me, earlier you were talking about chaos.
Yes.
But it seems to me that this is a perfect example of a response to chaos. What do you need to overcome chaos? And what answer needs is a strong central government.
Right. For those of you who may not have heard, the reference is to my previous comment about chaos and how a particular strong government is needed to impose enough discipline on the society to eliminate the chaos. Now that can go too far, as we'll see happens in a number of different countries around the world. We've already talked to it a bit about Russia in the last set of lectures, but it is absolutely a situation that if we look around even our country, and I use the word today, meaning that you can go back and look at it over the last 20, 30 years, and we lived through the 60s and 70s. We know about the chaos in the streets that occurred during the Vietnam War, as an example, and the riots in Watts, and the riots in Detroit, and things of this nature that literally burned down sections of cities. And we realized that at that particular point, we might say, you've got to stop this. Call in the National Guard. Well, in Europe, you didn't have a National Guard. You either had militia, like the black shirts, or, as you had in Germany, the brown shirts, on whom you would call to establish discipline in a community. This was something that becomes more profound as we get further on in our lecture. So the idea here, again, is to formulate the concepts. And I did have, on one of my slides before, in the last lecture, the role of government, and talked at some length about that. Keep that in mind as you think about the impact of what we're seeing in Italy and what we will see in Germany, as how this influences your own concepts of what is the true role of government. Now, you may remember there's a phrase attributed to Jefferson that the man who would trade security for liberty will end up with neither. Well, in a sense, that's what happened as well. All right. Now, I've already talked a bit about this, but I want to emphasize a couple of important parts that are very different from what we talked about in the Soviet, or Russia, this became Soviet Russia. And that is that in spite of Mussolini becoming what looked to be in effect a dictator, he still, in a way, had to answer to King Victor Emmanuel III. And you may remember that when Mussolini was overthrown, it wasn't a coup d'etat as such. Victor Emmanuel fired him as prime minister, said, you're just no longer capable of running this country. The second part is that private property was to be respected. That was not true in Russia. It remained true throughout, and it remained true in Germany as well. One of the key hallmarks of communism and socialism had to do with how you handled private property. Karl Marx basically said, if you want to sum up my theories, you abolish private property. Socialism did not necessarily look at abolishing private property, but what it did do, and even Woodrow Wilson was a proponent of this, was to have government direct private industries in what they could produce. Doesn't take away their private property, but it directs their production systems. And there were reasons for this that were supported by many and still are promoted by many. Individual freedom subjugated to the will of the state, in the sense that we need a cohesive society in order to function, in order to be able to do the things we want. And as a result, the government has a prime interest, an argument which is going on to this day with organizations like Twitter and Facebook and others As we know, many newspapers, in fact, throughout history, newspapers have been subjected to government influence, both good and bad, foreign and domestic, that you have to control speech and you have to control how ideas are expressed. Now, its most severe form occurs when you have a place like Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, less so Italy, which controls art, theater, operas, the press, indeed most expressions of your own culture. Something which was all designed to unify the people around a central idea, to get them working diligently for the state and through the state their own benefit. Now, some of the interesting things, and I asked a person these questions once. I said, how do you feel about the voting age being at 18? And there was one point where they dropped it down to 20. All right. How about universal suffrage? Women can vote, men can vote. Proportional representation based on the population in your particular region. We're right now, in today, you get to vote about redistricting issues related to the New York State Constitution. That's how fundamental these were. Formation of a National Council of Experts. Wilson particularly wanted this to happen. And it was done by FDR when World War II was on the horizon. He organized the business community and said, this is what you need to do. This is what we need to create to be the arsenal of democracy. And by the way, get ready for our entry into the war. Or you want another example, think of Donald Trump going to pharmaceutical companies and saying, get to work on a vaccine. I'm going to put Pence in charge and make you, talk to him and make this work. Just as simple examples, all right? So all of these different things, you'd look at and say, well, I don't see anything wrong with that. What about the abolition of the Senate? Well, the Italian Senate, as you see here, was pretty much an aristocracy and appointed by the king, who wanted to, promote the people close to him. Well, if you have a Senate that's only appointed by the king and represents the same people all the time, how is that really representative of you in your government? It's not. So this was one of those other elements we look at. What about labor? 8-hour workday? You kidding me? Who today would not think that's important? Minimum wage? This is 1922. Participation of workers in the function of industry. This could be unions, although there was some issue related to unions, as we'll see. Revision of the draft law on invalidity. I'm sorry about that particular word, invalidity insurance, invalid insurance, and reduction of the retirement age. Now, what was the life expectancy back in the 20s, especially in Italy? Well, it certainly wasn't 65. Okay, life expectancy, you were lucky to make it to 65. So you're to work until you're dead. Remember that when Social Security was put in place by FDR, the life expectancy in the United States was about 65, and therefore Social Security was affordable. Okay. What about military policies? Okay, short service, national militia. Conscription, it was sort of, but short term. We just need people who can come in, be disciplined, learn something about the nature of the country, about what you're defining and defending as a country. And then you can go home with that instilled in you and make you a better citizen. nationalize the armaments industry, because you have to be careful about the armaments industry promoting too much of their product as profit. Peaceful but competitive foreign policy. What's the word that President Biden has used? We accept competition, right? We don't want to be out there creating trouble. We want the war in Afghanistan and, ended. So we're going to do what we can to end it. Whether you like that or not is not the issue in front of us right now. Okay. The one place that he was strong about, though, and began to embrace was Imperial Italy. He began to look back on Italy's great days, Roman Empire and things of this sort, and how that was important. The very symbol for Fascisti actually dates back to Roman times. It's a bundle of sticks that represents that individually we are fragile. Bound together, we are powerful and strong. And the axe that is attached is to use against your enemies. What about finances? Progressive tax on capital. Expropriation of concentrated wealth. What is in front of us right now, if you look deeply into the $3.5 trillion proposal, and you look through some of the elements that are offered, have to do with exactly this. Now, we don't think of it as appropriation. We think of it as a tax. But the word appropriation is simply designed as language to keep you from worrying about the implications. One of the proposals, just to give you an example, is a tax on unrealized capital gains. So if you have an investment, let's say in the Ford Motor Company, and I don't know the numbers here, but let's just use it as an example, where Ford Motor Company stock was $20 and now it's $40, but you own 10 shares and you haven't sold it at $40. You think it's going to go up. What's the impact if you're taxed on the $20 increase that you haven't even realized? And suppose then, once you're taxed on that $20 increase, Ford drops to 30. So you have to be careful about some of these things, but it resonates because the wealthy, people like Bezos and Gates and others, you think, if we take their wealth, which they certainly don't need personally, then maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we should do that. And this is one of the things that Mussolini and his people were talking about. Religious congregations, bishoprics, and so on. Remember, these are all what we considered not-for-profit. They were off the tax rolls, but they had enormous wealth, both in terms of their property values and in terms, if you've been to the Vatican and been to the museum and walked through there, there are billions of dollars worth of art. Now, why should that not be used for the general population? Why not have churches pay taxes? This is an enormous amount of territory that no longer is taxable. Revise the contracts for military provisions because of the concern over inflated prices. And look at this, seizure of 85% of the profits in defense industries. One of the things that Bernie Sanders has talked about is that over a certain amount of money, we should basically take nearly all of it. If you add up, for example, the estate taxes in New York and the federal government over a certain amount, then the government, both state and federal, take about 85% of it that you can no longer pass on. Just as an example, these are the realities. But we can look at these and say, you know, this sounds pretty darn good. Okay. So this takes us to the particular stage. I already mentioned this, and I'll just pass past this one fairly quickly. Victor Emmanuel, as I mentioned, and then as Mussolini moves forward and gains more and more power, eventually able to pretty much do as he wishes, he brings his son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, to become his one of his main advisors. Subsequently, he ends up turning against Ciano because Ciano ends up turning against Mussolini and he has him shot. But these guys were not just non-entities. They had proven themselves, okay? And we keep this in mind because these people were capable in many different ways. Now, I already alluded to what had happened in Libya, and I'm going to spend the last few minutes of this particular lecture not so much on Libya, but I want you to see these particular slides, as I will on Ethiopia, because there's an enormous amount of significance to what was going on when Italy went to war in Ethiopia. The important part of this is that through this period of time, remember that initially Mussolini was against taking Libya. But over time, he felt that it was necessary to sort of finish the fight. Another way to think about this is, again, we remember, we dipped our foot into Vietnam, even during the Eisenhower administration, when he sent a few advisors over there. And then it became a foot in when you looked at Kennedy's actions and how he kind of kept going. And then you look at Lyndon Johnson, who kind of jumps in altogether. And again, I'm not arguing the political reasons for this or whatever, but the point I'm trying to make is that once you're in, it's very hard to get out. Now, we've seen that in Afghanistan. We saw that in Iraq. We've seen it in other places where, as a country, I think we end up shaking our heads sometimes and thinking, what were we thinking? The point here is that Libya had little to offer to Italy directly in terms of mineral wealth. A lot of it is desert. And although it was just across the Mediterranean Sea, it was really not a great place to send a lot of settlers either. But that was part of the intent. And Mussolini just found himself in the middle of this thing and continued it. But because of the nature of the perception of the native people at the time, it became a brutal conflict. And it wasn't that it was brutal only because the Italians were brutal. What we forget is that among many native tribes, what we look at as brutality was just part and parcel of the conflict. And I, again, make an allusion to something that, gets some people riled up. But if you look at how the early Europeans in North America conducted themselves against the Native American tribes, what is sometimes forgotten is that the brutality existed on both sides. There are descriptions in early American literature by colonists who have come upon a farmstead, for example, that had been raided by the Native Americans, and everybody's been killed. The children have been killed. They've been scalped, mutilated, whatever. And when you see this happening to your friends and neighbors, you're not so willing to say, well, let's see, Geneva Convention, which obviously didn't exist, but you're hardly willing to say, this calls for the same action. In fact, there was a recent article I just read just a little while ago about how this particular historian felt that the Europeans did not understand and respect how Native Americans fought, and therefore themselves became brutal. And I thought, well, that's a nice ivory tower to be in, as though, and it had to do, I'll be a little more specific for a moment. I apologize for the tangents, but you'll see where I'm coming from. It had to do with during the Civil War, there was I'll call it a rebellion on the part of a certain Native American tribe. And when it was finally suppressed, a total of 33 of the Native Americans were hung. It was probably the single biggest mass hanging that took place in American history. Now, there were others who were charged, and Lincoln had allowed them to be put in prison and so on. But 33 were hung. And this particular historian was saying, listen, you know, the Native Americans fight this way because that's the way they've always fought. So why are we getting so upset about it? You think to yourself, because if you kill innocent people and mutilate their bodies, you're not generating a lot of sympathy on our part. Okay. And so the gloves come off. All right. So this happens. Now, some of you may have seen the movie Lion of the Desert. It's a nice, interesting movie to watch. It has to deal with this particular conflict. And who was it that did Zorba the Greek? Anthony Quinn, yeah, plays Omar Mukhtar in it. And he's a wonderful actor, and it's kind of interesting. All right. When we're moving towards Ethiopia, however, things become a bit different. And this is one of the great transitions that takes place in Italy at this particular time, which has enormous influence beyond the event itself. As I mentioned earlier, that we have to be careful about certain perceptions. I used as part of the basis for this section a book that's called Days of the Emperor and Clown. The emperor obviously being Haile Selassie, and the clown, of course, being Mussolini. The very title gives you a sense of what the author is thinking and how he judges what's going to be written in his book and how he's going to portray these various characteristics. Now, after a while, you start reading this and thinking, gosh, you know, Ethiopia, it should be like the rest of the world. You know, I mean, we need to model ourselves after them, except Ethiopia had slavery at this time, okay? It was fractured into a great many different tribes. Repression was part and parcel of how you maintain power. And the paradox is that there was an Italian coastline, Italian Somaliland. As you move north from Italian Somaliland, which is where Mogadishu is, you may have heard of Black Hawk Down in Mogadishu. There was British Somaliland. Then there was a little French enclave, which had Djibouti as its main port. And then north of that was the Italian area called Eritrea. Now, even today, if you are paying attention to international news, you'll realize that the Ethiopians are fighting against the Eritreans, and they're fighting against the Somalis, and they're also fighting against one of their own provinces, the Tigray province, which was in the northeast. So Ethiopia is hardly settled as a country, right? But at the time, it was under reasonable control by Haile Selassie and others. Due to a particular conflict that occurred in a very isolated part of Ethiopia in the southern section called the Ogaden, there was an oasis there. The oasis was called Welwel, if I remember correctly, and I may have misspelled it. But this particular oasis was on this very ill-defined border between the Italian Somaliland and Ethiopia proper. Remember, it's in the middle of a desert. There's nothing around except this oasis. And the Italians sort of snuck in to Ogaden, and they set up a fort. Well, of course, the Ethiopians said, what the heck are you doing here? And they sent troops down to say, listen, you know, you got to leave. And the Italians were hardly going to leave, and some fighting broke out. And that became the excuse for Mussolini to attack Ethiopia. The European community knew it was coming. There were plenty of indicators that this was coming. And Marshal Badoglio took care of a part of the army coming from one direction, and Graziani was in charge of another. Now, Badoglio was preceded by De Bono. You'll see it in a map that I'm going to show you in a minute. But he kind of was desultory in his coming in. And as a result of this conflict, Haile Selassie went to the League of Nations because Ethiopia had become part of the League of Nations in 1923 when they agreed to give up slavery. And while he wasn't able to get slavery abolished throughout all of Ethiopia, he was working on it, so to speak. Notice who the Secretary Generals of the League of Nations were, right? An Englishman, a Frenchman, and an Irishman. The deputy secretaries are from these countries. Why is this important? Because behind the scenes, Italy was working with France and Britain in order to constrain Germany. So they made an agreement among themselves, which basically said, listen, ignore what we're going to do in Ethiopia, and we will not work with Germany. In fact, Hitler and Mussolini had met in Venice and disliked each other, and said, we'll work with you, France and Britain, to constrain Germany, because Germany at this particular time now, mid-30s, is beginning to rearm. Okay. There are a number of violations we'll come to shortly in discussing that. In addition, shortly before the war breaks out, the Chancellor of Austria was assassinated by a Nazi group in Austria. Austria was not at this time taken by Germany. The Anschluss had not occurred. And it was feared that a coup d'etat based on this Nazi assassination would occur. This frightened Italy in particular because they were very concerned about their northern boundary. What's going to happen if Germany takes this over? Think of Russia taking the Crimea in eastern Ukraine. What's going to happen to the rest of Ukraine? So the fear was deep-seated. As a result of this, the Britain and France, and look who the Secretary Generals are, say, okay, Ethiopia, maybe you don't matter so much in the large scheme of world politics. So in this particular situation, even though Haile Selassie delivers a very powerful speech in the League of Nations, looking for support against this aggression, he doesn't get it. But we need to understand why he didn't get it. The Stresa agreement, halfway down this particular thing, is that agreement that I just alluded to, where they got together and decided what was going to happen. Now, in the conflict itself, there are a couple of different elements I'm going to emphasize, and then we'll stop here very shortly. What did Ethiopia have that Italy needed? What was their biggest export? Coffee. All right. Now, who else was producing coffee? Brazil. Now, you can go to a store and get Brazilian coffee and get Ethiopian coffee and, whatever. Did Italy need a lot of coffee? They did import a fair amount, but it was hardly something they couldn't get elsewhere if they needed it. And some leather goods. They had practically no minerals, certainly no oil. They were in a very desolate part of Africa. Remember, I mentioned about the Ogaden having nothing. It was just desert. It was awful. And there was very little else in the way of any road systems. There was only one railroad that existed from Addis Ababa, which is the capital in the center of Ethiopia, down to Djibouti. There weren't even any ports because Ethiopia was landlocked. And it was hardly an issue where Ethiopia was going to invade the Italian province or area of Eritrea or Italian Somaliland. The major reasons for Mussolini instigating this particular fight were these. First, living space. Again, I can establish an Italian colony here. I've got Britain and France on my side. They're going to help me, get my people settled and this and that and the other. But it never occurred that there would be very many Italians going to Ethiopia to settle. The second reason, I can demonstrate Italian power and established colonies, which are the representation of a nation's power. Remember that after World War II, many of the colonies around the world, subjugated by many European countries, were beginning to get very unrestful. But it wasn't until after World War II that they actually basically divested themselves of their overlords. So back in this period of time, having a colony still represented a form of your nation's power. Unfortunately for Italy, both Libya and Ethiopia were nothing more than money pits. Cost them an enormous amount with very little to show for it, because neither country had much in the way of resources that could help Italy. The final part was that it allowed Italy to show the weakness, not necessarily deliberately, but it came along right with it, the weakness of the League of Nations. That is, that separate relationships with France and Britain allowed for Italy to do what it was going to do, and the League of Nations was powerless to do anything about it. There were a few sanctions that were leveled against Italy, and they went away very quickly. These particular elements are important. So what I'm showing just in these maps, because I always like to show maps, is how Ethiopia was being attacked. There was one other issue which may have played a role to some degree, and that is back in, I think it was 1895 or 96. The Italians had again tried to take Ethiopia, and they were crushed at a battle in the north area there and basically thrown out, which was a huge embarrassment. And there may have been some idea that we're going to go back and sort of revise this history. And instead of being beaten again, we're going to be successful. The war was conducted again on both sides with considerable brutality, but the Italians were by far the more lethal effect because they were willing to use mustard gas, for which Ethiopians had very little to do. They had armored vehicles, which when you look at them, you say, what a piece of junk. But in the context, if you don't have anything like it and you can't penetrate it with simple rifle fire, it becomes bad news for you. And they had aircraft, so they could bomb and strafe. And they could use long distance reconnaissance and things of this sort to prevent themselves from being ambushed. So all of these different things also stimulated the Italian military in a real exercise of combat. Now they began to learn more about the integration of various services. As you can see, they began to make great inroads until finally Haile Selassie leaves Ethiopia. He knows they're going to lose. He just has to end the devastation and in effect becomes exiled. And Ethiopia remains under Italian control until World War II, when the Brits drive them out. I point this out in terms of what else was happening at the time. This particular phrase that was considered important in retrospect, it is us today, it will be you tomorrow. The issue of sanctions ending soon after the war ends Italy is now recognized as an empire and in return recognizes the Japanese empire. We'll talk about that in next week. And that the Italians recognize the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. Because the world was now beginning to fall apart as different nations strode forward and asserted themselves on the international stage. Let's take a break for a few minutes. I'll answer any questions people may have, and we'll go from there.
Indians being hung.
I'm sorry.
The Indians being hung, the 33 Indians.
Yes,
Where was that?
it was out west. I can't remember if it's.
Minnesota. It
That's
was
where
the
they hung
Minnesota Sioux Uprising.
That's right.
Do you know anything more about the uprising?
I don't for that particular one. I just read through
Well,
that
it was
particular.
kind of interesting because I grew up in Minnesota.
Oh,
So I heard all this stuff. I also had family that lived, my grandfather actually grew up in the area of Sleepy Eye, which is named after a Sioux chief
mhm.
in southern Minnesota. They had a farm down there.
Really?
Yeah, and that was before he went, that's before he went up to Alaska for the gold rush.
Oh my
And
goodness.
before he came back and got his dentistry degree from University of Minnesota in 1904.
Oh my goodness.
But the point about the Indians is this.
Yeah.
The family lore is that there was the Sioux Uprising, and this is in Minnesota history books. There was the Sioux Uprising, and the women and children in the area went to the basement of the bank with a barrel of dynamite while the men went out to fight the Indians. And if the Indians prevailed, they were going to blow themselves to heck. Okay.
Yeah.
They did not prevail. Okay. But the question that was never raised in the whole time that I grew up in this as a kid in the state and all Minnesota history and everything, why were the Indians uprising?
Mm.
They were uprising for the fact that they're pretty much on kind of a reservation.
Yes.
I don't know if have you ever seen the Minnesota State Seal?
I have, but I don't
It's
remember.
worth looking at it
Okay.
because it shows a man with his plow and his horse, and it shows a stump with a rifle on the stump, and it shows an Indian on a horse riding into the sunset.
Really?
That's the Minnesota State Seal.
I'll be darned.
Yeah. Well, what happened with regard to the Indians was that they were kind of on a reservation, as I understand this now.
Right.
They had been promised by the federal government to be receiving certain
Yes.
things like food.
Yes, this happened
And
all
they were-
through the area.
Right. They were friggin' starving.
Right.
And finally, after about a year or something like this, and everybody's starving, the Indians decided they had to fight.
Yeah.
The uprising, what could have been more justified?
No, and there's story after story very similar to that
Oh, yeah.
in terms of how the government treated the Indians on the reservations. I mean, it's a horror show to read
Still
it.
kind of goes on, you know about it today.
Yeah,
Because
it's
we don't have water, we don't have this, we don't have that.
right, right.
You know, the crappiest land.
Yep.
You know, with the.
And if we, well, it happened in the Dakotas,
Yes,
where the Indians were promised a reservation, but when gold was discovered, people went in, miners went in
oh, yeah.
and started working. Of course, the Indians had started killing them. And then finally they said, we're going to drive the Indians out. We want the gold, and they're going to be displaced.
Yeah.
Hey,
So-
Dr. Vogt, could you let Tom fix the camera so we can see you out
Oh,
here?
sure. Hey there, Henry. How are you?
How are you?
No, those are fascinating.
Interesting kind of angle that you made on it.
Yeah, I'll turn my microphone off.
God damn Tom. I mean, John. He's crapped out at the last minute. He's talking about his blood pressure being too low for him to drive.
Well, that may be true. He was very, very sick for a couple of years.
A couple of years ago, that's fine. But, not now. He's just goofing off. I don't know what's going on.
I left,
Pisses me off so much.
I left you some chicken noodle soup,
Oh,
some chicken tenders, fried chicken tenders, and 2 lamb chops
oh, wonderful.
and light bulbs.
Okay. Yeah. Can't use the
I was
goddamn light
called, I
bulbs.
had to go to the school again, the school called me, they called me, he called me. He's taking him to his college soon, so he's stoked. See what's going on.
I've got to pay attention to this
Okay.
because they're trying to fix this camera. Okay, the world's fucking coming to an end here. Can't you just start his video and use gallery view or speaker view? Yeah. Yeah, that's okay. I see him now under Lyceum. That's fine. Now you got both views. Okay, Doc, you can put your mic back on. Can you unmute yourself, Doc?
Thank you for putting up with that. Okay,
That's
So
good.
Germany in the interwar years. Now, this is a very complex topic. I may not get through it in its entirety, but I want to try to get at least the critical elements covered. It's particularly important because most of us, I think, legitimately look on what happened with Nazi Germany as one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. Just in terms of the destructiveness, even within the conquered territories of Germany, putting aside the enormous damage done to the world at large through Germany's aggression. We all get that. At the time at which Hitler is reaching ascendancy, though, it's important for us to understand certain dynamics. As I said at the beginning of the lecture today, unless we're willing to divest ourselves of our hindsight, or in the case of if we lived in the 30s, our foresight over where things were headed, unless we understand that, we cannot understand how this came to be. And for me, this is one of the critical lessons that I try to get when I read history. How does this apply to my thinking today, not just a series of events? All right, so let's see if I can make this slide work. And we're losing my mouse. There we go. I think this will do it. Yeah. Now, historians have often pointed to the Treaty of Versailles as the fundamental cause of leading up to World War II. And there were people back in that time frame who looked at the Treaty of Versailles and said, we will have another war in 20 years. This is nothing more than a prolonged interlude. Even Hindenburg, as they beat Russia and forced Russia to surrender, looked at holding certain territories in the East in anticipation of another war coming. Not necessarily against France and Britain, but at least between Russia and Germany. The losses that Germany was forced to assume are listed here in part. And I'm not going to read this to you, but I want you to look at this list and understand certain things, particularly Alsace-Lorraine. Alsace-Lorraine had over centuries been either on the side of what we would now recognize as Germany or on the side of France, though there were different iterations of control. But the point is, it was a very mixed population, a very mixed language, a very mixed culture. Germany had taken Alsace-Lorraine away from France in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, and now had to turn it back over. For Germany, this is a 50-year holding of Alsace-Lorraine. It's now being returned. Territory gets settled back to Belgium and so on. The key elements that were of particularly great importance to Germany were these. They had to assume, as part of this treaty requirement, that they were responsible for World War I, that it was Germany that caused World War I to occur, the war guilt. In addition, they were forced to pay enormous reparations. Now, at the time, it's difficult to get an accounting of what this meant in terms of actual GDP of Germany at the time and so on. But remember, when Germany surrenders at the end of World War I, no German territory had actually really been occupied by the Allied powers. It was on the verge of collapse. They would have taken a good deal of German territory if the war had continued beyond 1918. But at the time the war concluded, Germany was still inviolate. And this created a particular mindset among many Germans that we were stabbed in the back. Now, who was responsible for that depended on the political entity with which you allied yourself. For the Nazis, who were growing up as a very, very minuscule, unimportant organization, it was obviously centered on the Jews and the communists. But among Germans altogether, what is sometimes not appreciated but is important is that there had been, long before this particular time, a real issue of anti-Semitism, even though during and prior to the war, Jews were well integrated into German society and culture and economics. This is somewhat analogous to what happened in Turkey in the Ottoman Empire with Armenians. They had been well integrated, though they were of a sort of second-class citizen, and they were seen as a different grouping. So when you needed to find a group against which you could turn and say, you are responsible for what's happening to us, it didn't matter that you had been integrated previously. You were still other. And by being other, you could be targeted. So it wasn't just the Nazis who were anti-Semitic in their approach. This kind of situation had pervaded not just Germany, but actually pervaded much of Europe at the time. And when I say Europe, I literally mean from the Ural Mountains all the way to Spain. Okay. This was a fundamental part of underpinning of European culture for literally centuries. And it did not lose its importance as we move into the 20s and 30s. The other part of great critical importance was that the restrictions on the German military were meant specifically to keep Germany from rising to a power. Remember, they occupy Central Europe and they are a formidable population. They're industrious, they're well organized, they're innovative and creative. What we don't want to see Germany do is rearm. And we're going to restrict them from being able to rearm. Now, we recognize a nation needs an army in order to defend its borders from incursions. If you don't have an army defending your borders, remember, they didn't have a border patrol, a National Guard. So the only way you defended your borders was with the army. And if you don't defend your borders, then what happens? Well, people move in. And if they move in, they take over territories. They begin to consolidate their ethnic groups. If you want an example, look at Estonia with the Russian population. Look at the Crimea with the Russian population that politically was supposed to be the Ukraine. Okay. Once you consolidate your ethnic groups in various areas, then it becomes pretty easy for a surrounding nation from which that population came to say, well, they need to belong to us politically. We're going to move our boundaries to incorporate them. Remember also that at this particular time, a route was opened through German territory to the port of Donzig. The port of Donzig created a connection for the new nation of Poland, which had been resurrected from its destruction over centuries before as a new nation, but with no outlet to the sea until this corridor was cut through Germany, which separated the main part of Germany from what became called Eastern Prussia. Chunk of territory. Think of Canada saying, we're going to cut a line through Vermont and Massachusetts to Boston. And that's going to be Canadian. And yes, you still have Maine and parts of New Hampshire and whatever. But you're saying, wait a minute, that's our country. Tough, it's gone. The other part of this is just to give a quick example of the territorial losses so you get an idea that this was not inconsequential. These territories were stripped away, and as you'll see the green section there, for example, that part of this stuff is occupied by the Allied forces in order to force Germany to pay the reparations and prevent them from militarizing their border. It wasn't that that the German border was going to be cut all the way back to that black line that you see. It was more a matter that we're not going to let you build fortifications here. And when we come to lectures on attempts at making peace throughout this period of time, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Important to keep this in mind because this was an enormous consequence for Germany. In addition, as the war was ending, there was a mutiny that took place at one of the major seaports where the German Navy was based at Kiel. There's a canal that cuts across the base of Denmark and leads out towards the North Sea. And Kiel was a place where the major part of the German Navy was ensconced to protect it from the British. The mutiny occurred because, for some reason, honor is what we'll call it. The German naval commander had said, we're going to send the fleet out and we're going to fight one last battle with the British Grand Fleet. And if we're all destroyed, but we're going down with honor. If you remember in World War II, the great battleship Yamato was sent from Japan towards Okinawa on a very similar suicide mission. And those people went and got destroyed before they even got close to Okinawa. Well, the German sailors were going to have none of it. They'd been also infiltrated in a good deal because they'd been static for so long by socialist and communist groups that were seeking to incite them to mutiny, much as it happened in Russia when there was a mutiny at Königsgrad. Okay, so keep this in mind. There's very great similarities here. This particular mutiny was eventually suppressed, but here were their demands, which really don't look all that bad when you think about it, right? I mean, you can kind of buy into this. This seems to make sense. Defensive measures involving bloodshed are to be prevented, all right? Similar things, very reasonable. Other ones. So the idea behind all of this, right, is that these were set up and rather quickly found support throughout much of Germany at the time. Again, the central government hadn't completely collapsed at this time, but remember, Kaiser Wilhelm now has to abdicate. He's moving into, I think it was Denmark or the Netherlands, I think it was the Netherlands, where he stays in exile. And now the head of government has to take over. The government structures has to rebuild itself, not as badly as happened in Russia, but they had to rebuild themselves in order to have a functioning government. And as is typical for this kind of situation throughout history, it becomes very chaotic. Now, this is called the German Revolution. We don't think of it in those terms. Most of us aren't even aware that there would be a term applied at this period of time. German Revolution? What are you kidding me? If anything, we would have thought that might have been Hitler's assumption of power. But this occurs as the war ends. Now, why is this particularly important? Look at the third element. In Bavaria, the city of Munich is declared a people's state. They literally had a socialist/communist party take over a particular state. It's as though Pennsylvania decided they were going to be a communist state. And in fact, they were going to separate themselves from the rest of Germany, and if they were really successful, promulgate this particular kind of organization throughout the rest of Germany. It would fracture them considerably. In one section, they actually created a Red Army. And we'll come to that in the revolt in the Ruhr, where they've thought to have had as many as 50,000 adherents. Again, we don't think about this. And it also occurs in other locations where Berlin is actually temporarily taken over in different occasions in order to overthrow the central government. So the point I'm trying to make here is just simply that in terms of trying to recreate a government, a functioning government, once the Kaiser leaves, you now have to find individuals who are willing to step up. And Ebert is one of the key people who's involved in this particular reorganization, if you look at it that way. In terms of organization, they had to move the government out of Berlin because the chaos in Berlin was so severe that the government just couldn't function. So they moved to the town of Weimar and they established a constitution. Think about the Philadelphia enclave in 1787 when you create the Constitution of the United States in 3 months behind closed doors. Kind of thing. And Ebert selected the president. They have to redesign the government. But unlike Russia, which destroyed the government structure and rebuilt it from the bottom up, they still were using fundamentals based on how the German system worked prior to the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm. But there were things going on. I mention these points because, again, if we look at this particular set of circumstances, we realize how forward-thinking they were, how they were trying to organize a system which was, in our current lexicon, liberal in nature, universal suffrage, secret ballots. Again, this actually sounds almost like the fascists, doesn't it? In what we saw earlier politically. The key thing that wrecked this system is that the president could issue decrees which would only be nullified by the Reichstag. Now, again, thinking about our modern American history, and it actually goes back to George Washington, that the president would issue what we call in our country executive orders. And these could only be nullified if Congress got its act together and said, you can't do this, right? Or that we're going to allow you to do this with a certain time frame. If you want to go back to Lyndon Johnson and look at the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, for example, it was supposed to be time limited. And it was initiated by Lyndon Johnson. And it led to our deep involvement in the Vietnam War, among other factors. I'm just trying to point this out because the idea behind it is that there are traps which one must understand exist within any constitution, including our own, which can lead to a form of dominance of one particular group or another, done legally according to their own circumstance, but in turn lead us down a path which is becoming increasingly dangerous. And for the Weimar Constitution, this indeed became very dangerous. There was an uprising, as I mentioned, in Berlin in 1919, and this was not just an affair of people walking down the street carrying placards. This is what happens. There are people shooting at each other, setting up barricades in the streets. This is violence, unbridled in many ways. The chaos is coming to a fore, and it's going to get worse in Germany in a particular way. Ebert, because he has this possibility of issuing decrees, look down that list. He issued 136 decrees. He also filed 173 libel suits. Again, look at our modern history. And you can see correlations here. Very interesting correlations. He tried to control the extremes by building a coalition in the center. But it was fragmented repeatedly due to undercurrents in various portions of the country that would get out of control here or there, and in their own particular region would force representatives in the National Assembly to think a bit differently. The Soviet state of Bavaria. Have you ever heard of that before? This is the kind of thing that in our own history, we sometimes are unaware of what's going on when we're told about Germany during this period of time. This was an actual declaration. So keep this in mind, because these all had to be suppressed. Ebert is stuck trying to control this. He can use the army to some degree, but the army's broken up as well. The soldiers had basically said, enough of this. I just fought 4 years. My friends were killed. I was wounded. I went back to serve again. I got wounded again. People were starving at home. All the rest of this stuff is going on in Germany. And the army is not as reliable as it used to be. In fact, some of the leaders of the army said, we're not going to use our army against our own people. There was a military organization, as it's called, the Frey Court, which was largely made up of veterans, much like we learned about the black shirts in Italy. The Frey Court did not become the brown shirts until somewhat later, and that becomes a complex story in itself. But I want you to understand that military organizations were rising up, and basically, if you were a political party with any kind of influence throughout any part of Germany, you had an armed group who was your support. So this wasn't a matter of just nice talks and placards. This was downright brutal fighting. So I mentioned these. These are the two people who got them started. Johannes Hoffmann was the first leader in Munich, and then he got kicked out by Toller. And then eventually Toller's deposed. This is the scope at which the Bavarian Social Republic takes as it declares itself. Think about that in terms of what that means for the country. Notice also that East Prussia is separated by that Polish corridor. Okay. Lenin. Even though the Soviet Union was in the midst of a civil war, communist cells were being established throughout the rest of Europe, largely supported by the Bolsheviks in Russia. They had a very direct hand in providing funds, sometimes arms, and certainly direction. And when the Communist International is formed, it literally is formed as an international congress that meets in Russia periodically to discuss how to promulgate the communist revolution throughout the rest of the world, not just Europe. Remember that Karl Marx thought Germany would be the site. Even Lenin kind of thought it would be the site of the first communist revolution, not Russia. So he was rather surprised. In fact, remember that it wasn't until late in the turmoil in Russia that Lenin actually left Switzerland with the help of the Germans and was sent to Petersburg to foment the revolution there. So I mentioned these points for us to try to really get it clear. Notice that when things happen, the takeover is harshly suppressed. You're not going to get much justice. You're going to get put up against a wall and shot. Another putsch that takes place in Berlin, this time it's the Frey Court. And this time again, Ebert has to look for how he's going to stop this. He calls for a general strike. And fortunately, it's one of the things that triggers the cap push to collapse very, very quickly. but the ramifications are severe. And this happens in the Ruhr, March of 1920. We're only a year and a half, roughly, after the peace treaty of Versailles was signed by the Germans. And look at what they're up against. Here's where you have thousands of Red Army workers. And again, this finally has to be crushed with the use of the German army in part, but the Frey Court most particularly. Estimated 1,000 rebels killed. Again, this is what's happening. But this isn't the end of the misery. What happens next? Again, something most of us don't know about. What is hyperinflation? It's not what we're talking about today when we're talking about a 4% inflation rate or even a 5% inflation rate. This is Venezuela recently, if you've read anything about what's going on there. All right, but look through this. There's a huge war debt. And the numbers vary a little bit depending on how you want to translate what a gold mark was worth in a dollar and whether you're talking about 1920, 21, or whether you're talking about 2021. But if you look at the third paragraph, it gives you an idea. The original value of the gold mark, 1873, 2,790 for a kilogram of gold. Okay, roughly equal 4 marks to $1. By 1919, because Germany borrowed heavily during the war to pay for the military events, goes up to 48 by 1921, 90. But that's not the end of it. Now the government's running out of gold. And it has to start trying to find foreign currency that it can use to pay its debts. Even when the United States with the Young Plan tried to permit loans to go to Germany, which would be turned back to pay Britain and France for the reparations, this still did not ameliorate the effect on the German economy and in particular their finances. So 320 marks, 7,400. Third paragraph, 4.2 trillion. Okay, how do you get out of this? You literally cost more to print a bill than the bill is worth. They had to completely restructure their financials and their currency in order to get themselves out of this. And it took an enormous effort. And here's the other question that I have not seen answered. During the period of hyperinflation, how did anybody buy anything? You could go to a bank in the morning if you had some money there, and by afternoon, that money wouldn't buy you what it would have purchased that morning. Even in a few hours, the prices were escalating to such a degree that I just don't know how people got food. Literally, I just don't know how you did it.
Barter.
You might barter, you might bring an object to a bakery and say, you know, I'll give you my furniture for a loaf of bread, but you know, you only got a certain amount of furniture. I just don't know how they did it. The restructuring was fortunate, but you'll notice the paper value down in that last thing, paper mark value set at 1 trillion paper to 1 rent mark. And you could reestablish the value of the Rentenmark, which was called a mortgage mark, right, back to the 1873 balance. I show this to you because that's a 50 billion paper mark bill that you might carry in your pocket. And over on the right, literal piles of money that were totally worthless, which had no purchasing value whatsoever. Think about what your country is now experiencing. This is before the Great Depression, okay? That hasn't come. And because you could not afford to pay the reparations, France occupied the Ruhr, one of your major mining and manufacturing centers, in order to try to force the government to pay the reparations, if necessary, in goods, coal, and steel. So you can't use this for your own production, your own rebuilding. So again, if you're Germans at this time, you're seeing a complete destruction of your nation, both politically and financially. Your geography's been torn asunder. How does this resonate? What do you look for in order to get out of this mess, which at the time looks to be an irretrievable situation? Where do you turn? Who can get you out of this? Is the Weimar government able to manage this? As you can begin to ask, maybe the government's completely incapable. And these people who are running this government, yeah, they're fat and happy. The rest of us literally are starving to death. How do we get out of it? Unless we understand this structure, we cannot understand what happened in Germany. Just look at the top, January, June 1918, the value of the Reichsmark to the gold mark ratio, and then look at the bottom. You just end up saying, you got to be kidding me. Extraordinary. Here's another example of it, just showing you the value of one gold mark in paper marks. Okay. Hard to imagine. So how do you come to an end of the chaos? Oops, sorry. 1923, the Nazi Party at this time is beginning to find its feet, if you will. It starts out as the German Workers' Party. Hitler, who has been wounded in the war, and we'll come to that in a little bit, and recovered, has begun to learn about politics. He's actually sent by the army to a school in order to learn about politics, and then used to infiltrate different organizations to try to find out which ones might be working against the central government to work to overthrow it. And he goes to this meeting of a small group of individuals called the German Workers' Party. And while he's there, he ends up speaking because he found some of their ideas very intriguing. Hitler had been remarkably well read during his early years up to this point. You know, we hear about the one-armed paper hanger, and we hear about how he's a failed artist and this and that and the other. But he was much more well-educated than we ever give him credit. And in terms of that, the ideas that were resonating in this small group, probably not a whole lot bigger than where we are right now, he stands up and he starts talking. And the people in that small audience are enthralled by what this man is saying. It's resonating with them deeply. And he actually becomes part of that party. By 1922, he's organized enough of it. Remember, this is a skill that it takes to bring other people in. It's not just a matter that you're personally popular and someone says, hey, you got to go listen to this guy. At the same time, he has to draw them in, and he has to organize, and he has to begin to create the tentacles that reach out into society and begin to find all that support that he needs for this to move forward in a time of utter chaos. How is this going to be fixed? 1923, he makes a gross error. There have been these different pushes that we've talked about already, but he feels the time has come that maybe we can be successful, only he's doing this in Munich. He also has, as part of his history, Mussolini's March on Rome that had occurred the year before. So he thinks it just takes the right push. And this structure will fall and will be in the ascendance. He actually gets Ludendorff, one of the most well-known and respected generals from the German army of World War I, to join him. Only they're met very quickly by opposition. A number of people are shot and killed as a result. And Ludendorff, untouched, simply walks into the line of the police and is accepted with no repercussions. Hitler is charged and sentenced to prison. Now, what of the chaos? I mention this because it's important to understand that in the period of time, now we're going 10 years beyond the push, that this is what's been happening in the German structure. Unlike our system, which, like it or not, the president's there for 4 years unless he's killed, dies, or removed from office, which has only been done or attempted on 3 occasions, right? So you have the impeachment of Johnson after the Civil War, Clinton, and then Trump. You have 14 different chancellors. German presidents of the Reichstag, not so many. But in this particular context, there's no consistent policy which is going to help steer the country out of the great difficulties it's facing during this period of time. And therefore, all the different parties are becoming very important in how they're going to work together or against each other. Now, one of the other interesting aspects that I talked about with the Treaty of Versailles has to do with the demilitarization of Germany. Now, Germany is not going to sit back quietly and accept these restrictions. And this particular General von Sicht, works out a relationship with Soviet Russia so that they can begin, the Germans can begin training and development of different weapons and doctrine. We'll talk about this at probably the last lecture of the series, in order to rebuild the German army and have it prepared for the time at which the Treaty of Versailles is finally abrogated or concludes. There were time limits to a lot of these different elements in the Treaty of Versailles. So within that, secretly, they're actually cooperating with the Soviet Russian government to create this situation. And in that, there's a great deal of subterfuge, some of which has to be kept from the government officials themselves. I mention this because this will have huge importance to what leads up militarily, finally, in the later 30s and in the World War II itself. Stresemann, you'll notice his chancellorship is very small, but he takes over as Minister of Affairs. And the reason, Foreign Affairs, the reason I mention it is because he becomes intimately involved in many of the negotiations that were going on to try to establish peace in the world through the 20s. And his particular involvement was to build the German reputation as an important player on the international stage. And his name, if you're doing any reading this period of time, will crop up frequently during this period as someone who was staunchly in favor of Germany's position on the international scene. An example might be that you think about China after the Chinese Civil War ends in 49, and it takes a long time for them to become part of the international community. But once they do that, they become a powerful influence on much that's going on. And this is true of Germany, even in the League of Nations, which they're finally permitted to join. I also mentioned this particular fellow, and the reason for it is that he had a great deal to do with the turnaround of the financial crisis. And notice that he was chancellor for a considerable period of time. He also became the president of the Reichstag, right? And finally ended up giving it up to Hindenburg. He became one of the benchmarks for the solidity of the German government. So through this period of enormous chaos that was going on, and you'll notice this goes into the Depression, which undermines his particular position, weakens him sufficiently. And I think I'm sorry, went too far forward. He is working particularly through the periods where there's still considerable turmoil in Germany. He avoids being involved in the Depression era. That happens to Hindenburg when he takes over. He becomes ambassador to the US in 1933, and it's kind of interesting that his position, if you read about the interactions between him and the United States government at that particular time, which is now FDR's first term, has a lot to do with how the United States responds to different things that are happening in Germany. And then he retires and survives the war. Hindenburg, we've seen before. The reason I bring him back forward is that he's going to be president of the Reichstag. Now, the president is not the same as the chancellor. This is part of the peculiarities of European governments. But what he basically does is first ends up trying to moderate the influences of the very extremist groups that are competing for complete control over German politics. And in this particular situation, in spite of his age, right, because he's not a young man at this particular time, he's actually able to do a great deal to stabilize the government and play off these factions against each other as he has to deal with turnover of chancellors. Remember that in this situation, it's a little bit like losing a vote of confidence if you're the chancellor. And then the president gets to pick the next person to become chancellor and form a government. And then if that government moves forward effectively and you maintain the confidence of the German people, all well and good. If you lose it, then you're kicked out, basically. And remember that prior to him taking the lead, there had been a number of presidents of the Reichstag, just as there had been a number of chancellors. The turnover was considerable. Underneath him and underpinning and creating support were these individuals, because the German army command, now remember, this is 100,000 with 4,000 officers, no tanks, very limited artillery, basically no Navy, no Air Force, all right? No submarines, anything of that sort. These gentlemen are responsible somehow for maintaining the integrity of the German army. And what they do through this period of time is absolutely astounding, because what they do is make every individual, that 100,000, basically being trained to become an officer. And they use a lot of subterfuges in order to place so-called civilians, but with military background, in various civilian organizations where they can begin to create structures which will fold into the military. A good example, there's a commercial German airline, okay? Lufthansa, we know of it today, all right? But in terms of the creation of airplanes, the military, through civilians who actually had military background, would help design those aircraft so in time they could be transports for parachutists or carry bombs or become reconnaissance aircraft. If you have a single engine plane, maybe we can design that so we can run in speed races, but you know, something that'd make a great fighter. Okay, all those kinds of little nuances that are going on at the time. And these men were controlling that system and making it work. Similarly, as we go through, these men are also become the senior officers who are going to run the German army in the first parts of World War II. So they have not only worked to build the army, they've created an infrastructure which allow them to expand it once the Treaty of Versailles is abrogated by Hitler. Now, I'm going to mention this, and then we're coming to 3 o'clock where we need to stop, but I want to emphasize a couple of important points. Again, think in the time frame. Forget what happens afterward, all right? In the time frame, this fellow served in World War I. He won the Iron Cross First Class. This is a very high honor. Maybe it's not quite the Congressional Medal of Honor, but it is certainly a Silver Star or something of that nature, which is an important medal to win for bravery. He served as a runner much of the time. Runners carried messages back and forth from one headquarters to another, often in the front lines, and many times, runners were killed. So this was not a job for the faint of heart. He's gassed as well. He ends up in a hospital when the war ends. And as I'd mentioned earlier, he begins to investigate these units like the German Workers' Party at the behest of the army itself. So if you're thinking about people selected, when you only can have 100,000 in your army, you're going to weed out any weak link, anyone you think is not up to managing the affairs and can eventually become an officer. So in this regard, he's kept on. But he moves more deliberately later to politics. And to just quickly show one of the elements that becomes critical is that in the lead up, as the Nazi Party begins to consolidate and become an important force in politics, it still is competing with a number of other factions in Germany. By no means is the Nazi Party dominant. The only way they have any effectiveness at all is through coalition building. So Hitler has to do that, and he has to do it with people he's brought around him who have the organizational ability, the skills to organize a political entity which can permeate much of what's going on and work even with opponents. It takes a great deal of skill to do this. One of the key formulations that happens is that due to the chaos in the German government, as 1933 rolls around, it becomes apparent that even though the Nazi Party is by no means dominant, it is one of the better led and organized political entities. And eventually Hindenburg has to appoint Hitler to build a coalition government. It's not Hitler taking the Nazi Party and taking over the government, not yet, but it's going to happen quickly. And what he does is he has to appoint him because he's the only one who can formulate a coalition government and do so with some idea that the government will function. Shortly afterward, there's the Reichstag Fire, which some of you may have heard about. Basically, think about somebody burning the Capitol building. All right, now January 6th, nobody, as far as I know, brought any incendiaries in to burn the Capitol building down. But think of it in terms of just that structure suddenly burning down. What would it mean? We'd say, who did that? You got to find those guys and you got to prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law, and you better get on it in a hurry. So what happens? They end up saying, in order for this to happen, we need to run an investigation, and we're going to do it very quickly because the German people are not going to sit back kindly, watch this. The head of the fire department actually is found arrested for abuse. He didn't do it. They just thought that he was a little too slow in coming to put the fire out. Maybe he was a co-conspirator. So he's actually imprisoned and then shot. 4 people are found, communists, even though there was some question whether the Nazis did this themselves, and that's still something that historians to this day raise as a question. But again, we don't know. You're thinking about what happened then, and I'm living at that moment. Okay? And what am I hearing? The communists did this. Out of the 4 who were arrested, only 1 was found guilty. So think about that for a minute. If you think you arrested the communists and you want to get rid of the communists and they're the ones who did all this, you kill all 4 of them. 3 of them found not guilty. Only 1 is found guilty. Now, at that time, execution by guillotine was legal. All right, this wasn't done as an expression of distress. But what happened subsequently was this. And Hindenburg has to agree to this. Hitler comes to him and says, listen, if we're going to control what's going on in this nation, these various articles of the Constitution, the Weimar Constitution, have to be suspended. And we have to crush those individuals who are working to undermine us. And in particular, we know that the communists are being fed arms and money from Russia to undermine our system of government. And if we permit them to have all the freedoms that we Germans are used to having, then they will simply kill us from within. And if you have any question about those issues, all you have to do, depending on whichever side of the political argument on, doesn't matter. Listen to what one side says about the other. Listen to how certain things are being said you cannot say, you cannot publish. And if you do, we're going to stop you from doing it. These are elements that have existed in the American experience, again, for decades at different times. There was an Anti-Sedition Act, all right, as an example, if you spoke against the government. Modern Turkey today, you can be arrested if you criticize the government. Okay? So this is nothing new in the human experience. But when you're dealing with chaos, when you're dealing with something that you see fundamentally is going to destroy your country and turn it into something completely different than your expectations are, then it's easy to say, well, let's suspend these things, at least temporarily, until we have the situation under control. So I'll stop here because it's now after 3 and you've been patient to stick with me. But now what we're going to see is the translation into law, the various things which bring to reality and allow the government to have the power to do the things it does, and how this translates into the lead up of World War II. Thank you for your attention. Any questions? I'll be happy to entertain you folks on Zoom. You can unmute if you wish to ask a question. And if you can't hear me, that's probably because I don't have an answer and I'm just going to move my mouth. And so you'll think I'm smart, but you're just not catching it. All right, well, thank you for your attention. Again, I hope you will show up next week and see how this play turns out. I'm sorry. Oh, yes, I know.